You've mourned long enough, Margaret. It's time to let younger people live their lives. My daughter-in-law said those words while lifting a crystal wine glass in the middle of my late husband's memorial dinner, and my own son sat beside her without saying a single thing. I didn't cry. I didn't argue. I simply folded my napkin onto my lap and smiled the same quiet smile I'd worn through 43 years of marriage, countless business dinners, and every family gathering where I had learned that silence often revealed more than anger ever could. I'm glad you're here. Stay with me until the end, and let me know where you're watching from, because what happened that night changed everything I thought I knew about my family. The dining room still smelled faintly like lilies from the funeral service earlier that afternoon. White arrangements lined the sideboard beside framed photographs of my husband, Arthur Holloway, smiling in moments frozen decades apart. In one picture, he stood on the deck of our first sailboat in Nantucket wearing khaki shorts and that faded navy sweater he refused to throw away. In another, he held our son Ryan on his shoulders outside Fenway Park when Ryan was barely 7 years old. The candles flickered softly against the polished mahogany table Arthur and I had purchased together nearly 30 years earlier after his company landed its first major contract. Every inch of that room carried traces of him. His reading glasses still rested near the kitchen counter beside the newspaper he'd never finished. His favorite jazz record sat untouched on the turntable in the study. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway seemed to tick more slowly now, as if the entire house understood someone important was missing. At 68, I thought I understood grief. I had buried both my parents. I had watched close friends disappear one by one over the years. But nothing prepared me for waking up in a bed that suddenly felt too large and too cold. Nothing prepared me for reaching across the sheets in the middle of the night and finding only silence. Earlier that evening, I had spent nearly an hour arranging dinner despite everyone insisting takeout would be easier. Arthur hated takeout. He believed important moments deserved real meals served properly. So I roasted chicken with rosemary and garlic, baked sweet potatoes with brown sugar, and set out the good china with the gold trim that only appeared during holidays and anniversaries. Brooke barely noticed any of it. She spent most of dinner scrolling through her phone beneath the table, while occasionally exchanging glances with Ryan that stopped the moment I looked their way. I noticed small things because that's what women my age learn to do. We noticed the pauses between sentences, the conversations that end too quickly, the tension hidden behind polite smiles. Ryan had barely looked at me all evening. My son, who once called me every Sunday morning from college just to ask how to make pot roast, now seemed uncomfortable sitting across from me for more than a few minutes. Grief changes people, I told myself. Maybe he simply didn't know how to handle losing his father. But then Brooke raised her glass. Arthur wouldn't want everyone sitting around feeling sad forever, she said brightly. Life moves on. I nodded politely and reached for my water glass. And honestly, she continued with that perfectly practiced Charleston smile, this house is far too large for one person now. Ryan shifted slightly in his chair, but remained silent. Brooke leaned back comfortably like someone discussing weather instead of dismantling another woman's life. You've mourned long enough, Margaret. It's time to let younger people live their lives. The room became so quiet I could hear the refrigerator humming from the kitchen. For a moment, I thought Ryan might finally say something. I waited for him to defend me, to remind his wife that his father had been buried only 6 hours earlier. Instead, he lowered his eyes toward his untouched mashed potatoes. Brooke's just worried about you, Mom, he muttered weakly. Worried? Such a gentle word for something so cold. I looked at my son carefully then, really looked at him. His expensive gray suit. The platinum watch Arthur had given him 3 Christmases ago. The tired lines around his eyes that hadn't been there before Brooke entered. His life. Suddenly, I understood something painful. My son wasn't leading his life anymore. He was following someone else's script. Brooke smiled softly as though she'd won an argument no one else realized had even begun. We just think it might be healthier for everyone if you started considering next steps. Next steps. That's what people call exile when they want it to sound compassionate. I folded my napkin carefully and placed it beside my plate. My hands remained perfectly steady. Of course, I said quietly. I understand. Brooke relaxed instantly. Ryan finally looked relieved. They mistook composure for surrender. That was their first mistake. Because at that exact moment, while candlelight flickered across Arthur's empty chair and rain tapped gently against the dining room windows, I realized something very important. I had spent my entire life protecting this family quietly, and I was finally ready to discover what would happen when I stopped. The house felt unfamiliar after everyone left that night. Not empty, unfamiliar. As though the walls themselves had overheard what Brooks said at the dinner table and no longer knew what kind of family lived there. I stood alone in the kitchen long after the dishes had been washed, staring at the soft yellow light above the stove, while rain slid slowly down the windows overlooking the backyard. Arthur planted those hydrangeas himself 12 years ago because he said southern homes deserved flowers that looked generous. Even now, despite the storm, the pale blue blooms bent gently beneath the rain instead of breaking. Arthur always admired that quality in things. Quiet endurance. I wrapped the leftover chicken carefully in foil and placed it in the refrigerator beside the blackberry pie nobody touched. Brooke claimed she was avoiding sugar lately. Ryan barely ate more than a few bites before glancing repeatedly at his phone throughout dinner. The silence afterward lingered in the air, heavier than grief itself. At nearly midnight, I walked upstairs to our bedroom and stopped at the doorway. I still could not bring myself to call it my bedroom. Arthur's slippers remained beside the bed exactly where he left them. The night before his heart gave out. His reading lamp still angled toward the chair in the corner, where he spent most evenings reviewing paperwork or reading biographies about presidents and railroad tycoons. For 43 years, that room had been the safest place I knew. Now it felt like a museum of unfinished conversations. I changed slowly into my nightgown and sat on the edge of the bed without turning on the television. The quiet pressed against me from every direction. When you are young, silence feels peaceful. When you are older, silence becomes crowded with memory. I reached toward Arthur's side of the mattress instinctively before stopping myself halfway there. My hand remained suspended for a moment before falling back into my lap. Earlier that evening, Brooke had touched that same bedpost while pretending to comfort me after dinner. "You should think about simplifying things," she said softly while Ryan loaded their coats downstairs. "A smaller place would probably feel less overwhelming for you." Simplifying things. Another polished phrase meant to make removal sound merciful. I closed my eyes and remembered the first time Arthur brought me into this house. Charleston humidity curled my hair instantly that day, and I laughed because the movers had accidentally dropped one of our dining chairs into the fountain outside. We were not wealthy then. Comfortable, yes, but careful with money. Arthur spent years building Holloway Logistics from a modest shipping brokerage into something respected across the Southeast. He worked impossible hours. I hosted charity luncheons, managed school schedules, planned fundraisers, balanced budgets, and made certain Ryan never noticed the strain behind the scenes. We built this life together brick by brick. Yet somehow, only 3 days after his funeral, I already felt like a guest wandering through my own home. The next morning I woke just after 6. For a few seconds, before memory returned, I almost expected to hear Arthur downstairs grinding coffee beans in the kitchen. Instead, there was only the low hum of the air conditioner and distant thunder rolling over Charleston Harbor. I wrapped myself in a cream-colored cardigan and walked downstairs barefoot. The marble kitchen counters felt cold beneath my fingertips. I poured coffee into Arthur's favorite navy mug before remembering he would never drink from it again. Even then, I could not put it away. Around 8:30, Ryan arrived unexpectedly. I heard his Mercedes pull into the driveway before I saw him through the front window. He entered without knocking the way he always had, though something about his posture felt hesitant now. "Morning, Mom," he said quietly. His eyes looked tired. He loosened his tie before setting his car keys onto the counter. "You are up early," I replied. "Could not sleep much." He nodded awkwardly and opened the refrigerator without asking, staring inside as though searching for something to say. I watched him carefully. My son used to fill every room with energy. Now he carried tension around like an overcoat he could not remove. "Brooke did not mean to upset you last night," he finally said. There it was. Not an apology. An explanation. I stirred cream slowly into my coffee. "Did she not?" Ryan sighed heavily and rubbed the back of his neck. "She is just trying to think ahead. The house is a lot for one person. Your father managed it until the day he died." The words slipped out calmly, but Ryan looked away immediately. That tiny movement told me more than anything else could have. Guilt rarely announces itself loudly. Usually it appears in small avoidances. A glance toward the floor, fingers tightening around coffee cups, conversations ending too quickly. Ryan cleared his throat. Brooke and I were actually thinking maybe we could help reorganize some things this weekend. Reorganize. Another harmless word hiding sharper intentions underneath. I looked past him toward the staircase leading upstairs to the bedroom Arthur and I shared for 4 decades. Suddenly, for the first time since the funeral, an uncomfortable thought settled quietly into my chest. They were not grieving with me anymore. They were preparing for what came after me. 3 days after Arthur's memorial dinner, the house no longer sounded like mine. That was the first thought that crossed my mind when I walked downstairs early Thursday morning and heard unfamiliar voices drifting from the sunroom overlooking the backyard. Brooke was speaking softly to someone on the phone, while Ryan murmured responses I could not fully hear. They stopped talking the moment my footsteps touched the hardwood floor. Silence has weight when people are hiding something. I learned that years ago during charity board meetings and business dinners where powerful men smiled while negotiating things they hoped nobody else noticed. Brooke appeared in the kitchen doorway wearing cream linen pants and one of my old serving aprons tied neatly around her waist. The sight unsettled me more than it should have. "Good morning, Margaret," she said brightly, holding a mug that belonged to Arthur. "I hope we did not wake you." We. Not she. Not Ryan. We. As though they had already become a unit operating separately from me inside my own home. "I have been awake for hours," I replied calmly. Brooke smiled and reached for the espresso machine Arthur bought during a trip to Italy 15 years earlier. She had never once used it before this week. "Ryan and I were just talking about making some updates around here," she said casually. "Freshening things up a little." Freshening things up. Another harmless phrase carrying sharper edges underneath. Ryan stepped into the kitchen behind her, still dressed in gym clothes despite barely exercising these days. He looked uncomfortable again. That expression was becoming permanent around me. "Nothing major, Mom," he added quickly. "Just small improvements." I nodded once and poured myself coffee. "Your father always preferred the house exactly the way it is." Brooke laughed lightly while opening cabinets that once required permission to touch. "Well, trends change." Trends. I looked around the kitchen slowly. White marble counters. Antique brass fixtures Arthur restored himself. The long farmhouse table where Ryan once built school science projects while I baked peach cobbler during summer thunderstorms. Nothing about this room was trendy. It was personal. That afternoon, after they left, I walked through the house carefully for the first time since the funeral. Grief had blurred everything before. Now details emerged sharply. The framed family photograph from Nantucket was missing from the hallway table. One of Arthur's leather-bound history books had disappeared from the study shelf. Even stranger, the guest bedroom closet stood completely empty, though I distinctly remembered winter blankets stored there 2 weeks earlier. At first, I wondered whether my memory was failing me. Older women are trained to doubt themselves quietly. Misplaced keys become signs of aging. Forgotten details become warnings. But something deeper unsettled me now. Around 4 o'clock, I heard tires crunch softly against the gravel driveway. Through the front window, I saw a silver Lexus pull beside the fountain. Evelyn Parker stepped out carrying a navy umbrella despite the clear weather. I had not seen her in nearly 6 months. Evelyn and Arthur worked together during the early years of Holloway Logistics before she retired to Savannah. She still carried herself with the same calm precision I remembered from decades of fundraising galas and company retreats. "Margaret," she said softly the moment I opened the door. Her expression immediately told me this was not a social visit. "May I come in?" We sat together in the library where Arthur used to drink bourbon while reviewing shipping contracts late at night. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight, crossing the Persian rug. Evelyn kept both hands folded tightly over her purse for nearly a full minute before speaking. "Arthur called me about 3 months before he passed," she said quietly. My chest tightened instantly. "About what?" Evelyn hesitated carefully. "About Brooke." I did not respond. I simply waited. Older women understand that silence often makes people tell the truth faster. Evelyn lowered her eyes briefly. Arthur became concerned after noticing several meetings Brooke arranged with a real estate group downtown. I felt something cold settle beneath my ribs. Real estate. She toured properties repeatedly. Evelyn continued. Not for herself. For this house. The room suddenly seemed smaller. I stared toward the tall bookshelf Arthur built with his own hands 20 years ago while Evelyn's words settled slowly into place. "There is more," she added gently. Arthur believed Ryan was involved too. I closed my eyes briefly. Somehow that hurt more than Brooke herself. A stranger's ambition is easier to understand than your own child's silence. Arthur did not want to upset you unless he became certain, Evelyn continued. But shortly before his surgery, he asked me to keep an eye on things if anything happened to him. Surgery. The surgery that was supposed to extend his life another 10 years. The surgery none of us expected would end with complications and a phone call at 2:17 in the morning. I stared at the fireplace mantel where Arthur's silver anniversary photograph still stood untouched beside mine. Why are you telling me this now? Evelyn's voice softened. Because yesterday I saw Brooke leaving Caldwell Realty with floor plans for this property. My fingers tightened around the teacup resting in my lap. Suddenly Brooke's comments at dinner sounded different. Simplifying things. Freshening things up. Moving forward. They were not suggestions. They were preparations. Evelyn reached across carefully and touched my hand. Margaret, she whispered, I do not think they are waiting for you to make a decision. For several seconds I said nothing at all. Outside, wind moved gently through Arthur's hydrangeas beside the porch. Somewhere upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed 5 slow times into the growing silence. Then, for the first time since Arthur died, I felt something stronger than grief rise quietly inside me. Clarity. After Evelyn left that evening, I remained alone in the library long after sunset darkened the windows overlooking the backyard. The grandfather clock ticked steadily beside the fireplace, while shadows stretched slowly across the hardwood floor. I sat in Arthur's leather chair holding my untouched tea, replaying every conversation from the past year inside my mind. It is strange how betrayal rarely arrives as one dramatic moment. Usually it reveals itself backward. Tiny memories begin rearranging themselves until the truth forms quietly in front of you, like a photograph developing in water. Suddenly, things that once seemed harmless no longer felt innocent at all. I remembered last Thanksgiving when Brooke insisted on hosting dinner at their downtown condominium instead of here at the house. She claimed parking would be easier for guests. But halfway through dessert, I overheard her telling one of Ryan's co-workers that maintaining large homes at my age was emotionally unhealthy. At the time, I smiled politely and pretended not to notice. I remembered Christmas morning when Arthur spent nearly 20 minutes searching for the silver key to the upstairs office filing cabinet. Brooke offered to help him look while Ryan distracted me in the kitchen asking questions about old family recipes. We eventually found the key sitting neatly beside the upstairs bathroom sink. Arthur thought he misplaced it himself. Now I was not so sure. Even smaller things returned to me with painful clarity. Brooke asking casual questions about trust funds during lunch at the country club. Ryan suddenly becoming interested in property taxes after years of ignoring financial matters completely. The strange afternoon 2 months earlier when I came home from church and found Brooke standing alone inside the library, studying family photographs on the mantel with an expression I could never quite understand. Not sentimental. Calculating. At the time she smiled quickly and claimed she was looking for decorating inspiration. I believed her because trusting family becomes habit after enough years. Around 9 o'clock, I finally stood from Arthur's chair and walked upstairs toward our bedroom. The hallway felt colder than usual. Outside, soft rain tapped gently against the windows while distant thunder rolled somewhere over Charleston Harbor. I opened the bedroom door slowly and paused. Arthur's side of the room remained exactly as he left it. Navy robe hanging behind the bathroom door. Reading glasses beside the lamp. Wallet resting neatly on the dresser near his cufflinks. I crossed toward the closet and knelt carefully beside the lower shelf where Arthur kept an old cedar box containing important documents. He never trusted banks entirely. Paper survives longer than promises, he used to say. My fingers trembled slightly as I lifted the lid. Several folders remained inside exactly where I expected them. Insurance records, tax returns, property maps from years earlier. But the dark blue folder containing trust paperwork was gone. Completely gone. For a moment, I simply stared at the empty space where it should have been. I knew Arthur's organizational habits better than my own heartbeat. He never misplaced important papers. Never. Slowly, I stood and crossed toward the small wall safe hidden behind one of Arthur's oil paintings near the bathroom entrance. My pulse quickened as I entered the combination. The safe opened with its familiar metallic click. Inside sat jewelry boxes, passports, sealed envelopes, and several stacks of legal papers tied neatly with ribbon. But again, something felt wrong. Certain folders were missing. Property deeds, investment summaries, partnership agreements connected to Holloway Logistics. Missing. I closed my eyes briefly and inhaled slowly through my nose. Brooke's comments. Ryan's silence. The meetings with realtors. The disappearing paperwork. None of it felt accidental anymore. Then, beneath a stack of old insurance documents, I noticed a cream-colored envelope with my name written across the front in Arthur's unmistakable handwriting. Margaret. Just that. No date. No explanation. My hands suddenly felt cold as I opened it carefully. Inside rested a single folded letter. The paper smelled faintly like Arthur's cologne, cedarwood, and tobacco. I sat down slowly on the edge of the bed before unfolding it. Margaret, if you are reading this, something has already gone wrong. Those were the first words. Tears burned behind my eyes instantly, but I kept reading. Arthur's handwriting remained steady throughout the page. He explained that over the past year he had noticed unusual behavior involving financial records and private conversations stopping whenever he entered rooms unexpectedly. He wrote that Brooke had repeatedly pressured Ryan to discuss inheritance matters long before either of us considered death seriously. Most painful of all, Arthur admitted he feared Ryan was becoming someone he barely recognized. Halfway down the letter, one sentence stopped me completely. If they rush you after I am gone, do not react immediately. Silence gives dishonest people confidence. Let them underestimate you. I stared at those words for a very long time. Downstairs, the house creaked softly as rain continued falling outside. Arthur knew. Somehow, even while fighting for his health, he had already seen this storm coming. Near the end of the letter, another line appeared underlined twice. Thomas Green has everything you need. Trust no verbal promises. Only sign once. Thomas Green, our family attorney for nearly 30 years. The man who handled every contract Arthur ever signed. I folded the letter carefully back into its envelope and pressed it gently against my chest. Grief still lived inside me. That had not changed. I still missed Arthur with an ache so deep it felt physical. But now grief stood beside something else entirely. Awareness. And for the first time since the funeral dinner, I no longer felt like the weakest person in the house. The following week unfolded with the strange politeness people use when they believe they are slowly taking control of something valuable. Brooke became sweeter in public and colder in private. Ryan drifted somewhere in between, avoiding conflict the way frightened people avoid mirrors. Every morning I woke before sunrise and carried Arthur's letter downstairs to the library where I reread certain lines while drinking coffee beside the window overlooking the garden. Silence gives dishonest people confidence. Let them underestimate you. Those words settled deeper into me each day. By Friday afternoon, the atmosphere inside the house had changed completely. Brooke no longer knocked before entering rooms. She moved through the halls with the relaxed confidence of someone mentally rearranging furniture she already believed belonged to her. I noticed small details first. Fresh flowers appeared in the dining room, but not the kind I usually bought. Brooke preferred white orchids because they looked cleaner. The antique brass lamp in the sitting room disappeared and was replaced with a sleek modern fixture that looked more appropriate in a hotel lobby than a Charleston family home. Even the kitchen pantry had been reorganized without anyone asking me. I thought this layout might be easier for you, Brooke explained lightly while moving my tea tins onto a lower shelf one afternoon. Easier for you. The phrase irritated me more than open cruelty would have. Older women understand the insult hidden inside unnecessary kindness. It suggests weakness without directly saying the word. I simply nodded and returned the tea tins to their original place after she walked away. That evening, Ryan arrived carrying several cardboard boxes from an office supply store. What are those for? I asked calmly while he set them near the staircase. Just organizing things, he answered too quickly. Brooke thought we could start sorting paperwork before it becomes overwhelming. As though grief itself were an inconvenience requiring efficient storage solutions. I looked at the boxes quietly. Your father has been gone less than 2 weeks. Ryan exhaled heavily and rubbed his forehead. Mom, nobody is trying to upset you. But they were. Not loudly. Not dramatically. They were doing it through tiny removals. Tiny assumptions. Tiny decisions made without me. That was the cruel brilliance of it. Nothing individually looked terrible enough to confront directly. Yet together they formed something unmistakable. Erasure. The next morning, I walked downstairs and stopped halfway along the hallway near the kitchen. The alarm panel beside the garage entrance had been replaced overnight. New keypad, new screen, different code system. Brooke stood nearby drinking green juice from one of my crystal tumblers. "Oh, good. You are awake," she said casually. The security company came early. I stared at the panel. Why was it changed? The old system was outdated, Brooke replied with a small shrug. This one is much simpler. Ryan stepped into the hallway behind her carrying his laptop bag. He would not meet my eyes again. "I was going to explain it to you later, Mom." "And the code?" I asked quietly. Brooke smiled politely. "We can program something easy for you to remember. For you. Not for us. Not for the family. For you." Like I was a temporary guest requiring simplified instructions inside someone else's home. I looked directly at Ryan then. "Did your father approve replacing the security system before he died?" Ryan hesitated 1 second too long. "No," he admitted softly. "But things are different now." Different now. I repeated those words silently long after they left for work. Around noon, I walked slowly through the upstairs hallway and noticed the master bedroom door standing partially open. Inside, several of Arthur's suits were missing from the closet. My stomach tightened instantly. Brooke's voice floated from the guest room nearby while she spoke on the phone. "No, definitely before summer," she whispered. "The location alone makes it worth at least $4.2 million. I froze. $4.2 million. She was discussing my home like a property listing while my husband's shoes still sat beside our bed downstairs. "Ryan thinks his mother will eventually agree," Brooke continued softly. "She is emotional right now, but she will come around." Emotional. Such a convenient word people use when they want to dismiss someone older without sounding cruel. I stepped backward silently before she noticed me and returned downstairs with steady hands despite the anger building quietly beneath my ribs. Later that afternoon, I sat alone on the back porch watching rain clouds gather over the marsh beyond our property line. Arthur loved summer storms. He said the air always felt more honest afterward. I folded his letter carefully inside my cardigan pocket and listened to distant thunder rolling over the water. Then my phone rang. Thomas Green. I stared at his name on the screen for several seconds before answering. "Margaret," his calm voice said gently. "I think it is time we met." My fingers tightened around the phone. "Did Arthur speak with you before he passed?" There was a brief pause on the line. "Yes," Thomas replied quietly. "And I believe he expected exactly what is happening now." For the first time in days, I smiled. Not because I felt victorious. Not yet. But because I finally understood something Brooke and Ryan still did not. They believed I was grieving too deeply to notice what they were doing. They believed silence meant surrender. They had forgotten that Arthur and I built our lives together long before either of them understood how power truly worked. And power, when used properly, rarely needs to raise its voice. Thomas Green's office sat on the third floor of an old brick building overlooking Meeting Street, the same building where Arthur signed the first major contract that transformed Holloway Logistics from a struggling shipping company into something powerful enough to change our lives forever. I had not visited Thomas there since before Arthur's surgery. Walking through those familiar hallways now felt strangely emotional, like stepping back into a version of my life that still made sense. The receptionist greeted me softly and led me toward Thomas's private office where tall windows overlooked the slow Charleston traffic below. Everything inside smelled faintly of leather, cedarwood, and old paper. Arthur always trusted people whose offices smelled like books instead of perfume. "Margaret," Thomas said quietly as he stood to greet me. His expression carried the same careful sadness I had seen at the funeral, but beneath it I noticed something else too. Concern. Real concern. He waited until the office door closed before speaking again. "How are you holding up?" "I am beginning to understand things more clearly," I answered calmly. Thomas studied me for several seconds before nodding once. "Arthur hoped you would." He crossed toward a large mahogany cabinet near the wall and removed a thick black folder secured with 2 silver clasps. My heartbeat slowed strangely the moment I saw it. Not from fear, from recognition. Arthur used identical folders whenever something mattered enough to protect carefully. Thomas placed it gently on the desk between us, but did not open it immediately. "Your husband came to see me privately 6 weeks before his surgery," he explained. "He was worried." I folded my hands together in my lap and listened. "Worried about Brooke?" Thomas sighed softly. "Primarily, but also about Ryan." Hearing my son's name spoken that way still hurt more than I expected. Thomas opened the folder slowly and removed several documents organized with colored tabs. Arthur noticed unusual requests involving financial records over the past year. Brooke repeatedly pushed Ryan to ask questions about ownership structures, trusts, and inheritance timelines. Timelines. The words sounded cold inside the quiet office. Did Ryan know what she was doing? I asked carefully. Thomas hesitated. I believe Ryan convinced himself these conversations were practical rather than inappropriate. Practical. Another polished word people use when greed becomes difficult to disguise openly. Thomas slid one document across the desk toward me. It was a copy of the property trust connected to our home. My eyes moved slowly across the familiar legal language until one paragraph stopped me completely. The Charleston property cannot be sold, transferred, or refinanced without direct approval from Margaret Holloway during her lifetime. I looked up immediately. Thomas nodded once. Arthur changed the trust structure last year. Ryan does not own the house. No, Thomas answered calmly. And neither does Brooke. For the first time in weeks, I felt my lungs fully expand. Not relief exactly. More like stability returning beneath my feet. Thomas continued carefully. Arthur also established additional protections in case anyone attempted to pressure you financially after his death. He handed me another document. This one outlined conditions tied to Ryan's inheritance distributions. Several clauses had been highlighted neatly in yellow. One sentence stood out immediately. Any beneficiary found coercing or manipulating Margaret Holloway regarding property liquidation may forfeit discretionary trust privileges indefinitely. I read the line twice before setting the paper down slowly. Arthur truly had seen everything coming. Why did he not tell me? I whispered. Thomas removed his glasses and rubbed the bridge of his nose tiredly. Because he hoped he was wrong. Silence settled briefly across the office. Outside the windows, church bells rang faintly somewhere downtown. Finally, Thomas leaned forward slightly. Margaret, there is something else you need to. No. My stomach tightened. Thomas opened another section of the folder and revealed printed bank records. Large transfers had been circled carefully in blue ink. Several withdrawals were initiated using temporary authorization forms during Arthur's hospitalization. I stared at the numbers without speaking. Tens of thousands of dollars moved gradually over 6 months into accounts connected to a luxury property group Brooke had secretly formed under another business name. Was it legal? I asked quietly. Thomas chose his words carefully. Technically, the authorization forms existed. But Arthur became suspicious after noticing signatures submitted during periods when he was heavily medicated. My chest went cold. Not because of the money itself. Arthur and I had more than enough. What wounded me was the patience behind it. The planning. The assumption that sickness and grief would make us vulnerable enough not to notice. Thomas watched me closely. Margaret, if you wish, we can address this immediately. I looked down at Arthur's familiar signature printed across one of the documents. Even there, inside legal paperwork, his handwriting looked calm and controlled. Silence gives dishonest people confidence. Let them underestimate you. Arthur's words echoed quietly inside my mind again. I lifted my eyes toward Thomas. No, I said softly. Not yet. He studied me for a moment before understanding settled across his face. You want to wait. I want to see how far they are willing to go. Thomas leaned back slowly in his chair. Arthur said you might say that. A faint smile touched my lips for the first time in what felt like months. Did he? Thomas nodded. He told me something during our final meeting that I never forgot. I waited quietly. Thomas's expression softened slightly. He said people often mistake your kindness for fragility. I looked toward the windows where late afternoon sunlight stretched across Charleston's old streets below. Arthur understood me better than anyone ever had. Even now. Especially now. Before leaving, Thomas handed me a smaller sealed envelope. Only open this if Brooke publicly forces the issue, he instructed carefully. Arthur was very specific about that. I slipped the envelope into my purse beside Arthur's letter and stood slowly from the chair. As I walked toward the office door, Thomas spoke one final sentence behind me. Margaret, your husband spent 43 years building safeguards around the people he loved. I paused quietly. Then perhaps, I replied softly. It is finally time those safeguards were used. By the second week after Arthur's funeral, Brooke had fully transformed the house into a stage for appearances. Every afternoon brought fresh deliveries. White floral arrangements lined the foyer. Rental catalogs covered the dining room table. Crystal champagne flutes arrived in large cardboard boxes stacked near the kitchen entrance. Brooke moved through the halls with restless excitement while speaking constantly about guest lists, sponsors, and photographers. She was organizing a charity gala for the Charleston Children's Foundation, an event she had spent years trying to host herself. Arthur always politely declined involvement. He believed charity should happen quietly, without cameras. Brooke believed the opposite. "This event is going to be beautiful," she announced one morning while reviewing seating charts across the breakfast table. "The Holloway estate is the perfect backdrop." The Holloway estate. Not our home. Not your father's house. Already she spoke about it like a brand. Ryan sat nearby scrolling through emails on his tablet without contributing much to the conversation. He looked exhausted lately. Shadows rested beneath his eyes, and his shoulders carried constant tension. Guilt changes people physically before they ever admit the truth aloud. "The foundation board is thrilled," Brooke continued brightly. "People are excited to see the property before renovations." I looked up slowly from my coffee cup. "Renovations?" Brooke froze for half a second before smiling again. "Just cosmetic updates eventually. Nothing dramatic." Ryan finally glanced toward me nervously. "It is only ideas, Mom. Ideas. Plans. Visions." Every word carefully softened to sound harmless. I folded my napkin calmly beside my plate. "Interesting," I replied quietly. Brooke relaxed again almost immediately. She still believed my silence meant confusion instead of observation. That misconception was becoming useful. Over the next several days, strangers wandered through my home constantly. Caterers measured dining tables. Florists studied lighting near the staircase. Event planners photographed the backyard garden Arthur spent 20 years cultivating himself. I watched everything quietly. Nobody asked my permission anymore. Brooke simply informed me what was happening as though I were an elderly relative visiting temporarily rather than the woman who built every inch of that life beside her husband. One afternoon, I walked into the library and found two young assistants removing family photographs from the shelves. "What are you doing?" I asked calmly. One of the girls looked startled. "Mrs. Holloway asked us to make the room look less personal for the gala." "Less personal?" I stared at the framed photograph in her hands. Arthur and I stood together beneath autumn trees in Vermont during our 40th anniversary trip. His arm rested around my shoulders while I laughed at something outside the frame. 40 years reduced to clutter for better event aesthetics. "Please put that back," I said softly. The assistant immediately obeyed without argument. Later that evening, Brooke approached me carrying fabric samples and a tablet full of event renderings. "Margaret, I wanted to show you the final design concept." I looked at the screen briefly. White drapery, gold lighting, modern lounge furniture replacing Arthur's antique oak tables. Even the library looked unrecognizable. "It is elegant," I replied evenly. Brooke smiled proudly. "I knew you would appreciate it. Honestly, this house has so much untapped potential." There it was again. Potential. Not memory. Not family. Not legacy. Just value waiting to be monetized. Ryan entered midway through the conversation and stopped awkwardly near the doorway. "Mom," he began carefully. "Brooke thought maybe during the gala we could introduce you as taking a step back from managing the estate." I remained perfectly still. "Taking a step back. Only socially," Brooke added quickly. "People naturally expect transitions after a loss." Transitions. Another polished word disguising removal. I studied my son carefully. His tie hung slightly crooked. His wedding ring rotated nervously around his finger while he spoke. Somewhere beneath all this pressure, the little boy Arthur carried on his shoulders at baseball games still existed. But he was buried deeply beneath fear, ambition, and Brooke's influence. "If that is what makes everyone comfortable," I answered quietly. Brooke visibly relaxed again. Ryan looked relieved. Neither realized how much information people reveal once they believe resistance has disappeared. The night before the gala, I sat alone in the library after everyone went upstairs. Arthur's letter rested folded beside me while soft jazz played quietly through the old speakers near the fireplace. Outside, warm summer rain drifted gently across the garden. The entire house smelled faintly of roses and fresh polish from the event preparations downstairs. My phone buzzed softly beside the lamp. A message from Thomas Green. "Everything is ready if needed tomorrow." I stared at the words for several seconds before locking the screen again. Across the room, moonlight reflected against the framed photograph Brooke tried removing earlier that week. Arthur's smile looked calm and knowing, even frozen behind glass. I suddenly remembered something he once told Ryan during a difficult business negotiation years ago. The person speaking the loudest in the room usually has the weakest position. Brooke had been speaking constantly for days, explaining, planning, controlling, performing certainty so aggressively that nobody questioned her authority anymore. Nobody except me. The following evening, luxury cars lined the circular driveway while photographers snapped pictures beneath glowing lanterns wrapped around the oak trees outside. Women in silk gowns drifted through the foyer, holding champagne, while a string quartet played softly near the staircase. Brooke descended the grand staircase wearing a pale gold designer dress with diamonds glittering at her throat. She looked radiant, confident, victorious. Ryan followed beside her, looking far less certain. "There she is," Brooke announced brightly when she spotted me near the entrance hall. "The woman who built the Holloway legacy." Guest smiled politely while turning toward me. Brooke stepped beside me and placed one manicured hand lightly against my arm. "Margaret has finally decided it is time to simplify life and focus on herself after Arthur's passing," she declared warmly. "We are all helping her embrace this beautiful new chapter." Applause fluttered softly around the room. I smiled gently while dozens of strangers watched me beneath crystal chandeliers and candlelight. Then I looked directly at Brooke and spoke for the first time all evening. "Actually," I said calmly, "before this night continues, there is something everyone deserves to hear first." The music stopped first. Not dramatically, just a slow, uncertain fading of violin strings as conversations throughout the ballroom softened into confused silence. Brooke's hand remained lightly wrapped around my arm, but I felt her fingers tighten almost instantly. Around us, Charleston society stood beneath crystal chandeliers holding champagne glasses and polite smiles frozen halfway across their faces. Nobody moved. Wealthy people are trained to recognize tension quickly. "Margaret," Brooke laughed softly, though the sound carried strain now, "you do not need to make a speech." I turned toward her calmly. "I think Arthur would have wanted honesty in his home." The room grew even quieter. Ryan stepped forward immediately. "Mom," he said under his breath, "this is not the right time." "Actually," another voice interrupted from the foyer entrance, "this is precisely the right time." Every head turned toward the doorway. Thomas Green stood near the entrance in a dark navy suit, holding a slim leather portfolio beneath one arm. He looked composed, deliberate, entirely unsurprised by the tension unfolding around him. Brooke's expression shifted instantly. Not panic yet, but calculation. "Thomas," she said carefully, forcing another smile, "we were not expecting legal business tonight." "No," Thomas replied evenly. "But Arthur Holloway was." A faint murmur moved through the crowd. Several guests exchanged confused glances while Ryan's face slowly lost color. I remained silent beside the staircase, watching everything unfold exactly as Arthur predicted. Thomas crossed the room calmly until he stood beside me beneath the chandelier light. "Margaret asked me here this evening to clarify several matters regarding the Holloway estate," he announced politely. Brooke laughed again, though the sound felt brittle now. "Surely that can wait until after the fundraiser." "Unfortunately," Thomas answered, "certain public statements made tonight require immediate correction." The room became perfectly still. Brooke removed her hand from my arm slowly. Ryan looked trapped somewhere between embarrassment and fear. Thomas opened the leather portfolio carefully and removed several documents clipped neatly together. First, he began calmly. "The Charleston property commonly referred to as the Holloway estate does not belong to Ryan Holloway." A sharp silence followed. I watched Brooke's posture stiffen immediately. Thomas continued without raising his voice. "The property remains fully protected under a private trust controlled exclusively by Margaret Holloway during her lifetime. It cannot be sold, transferred, renovated, refinanced, or publicly marketed without her direct written approval." Across the room, one of the foundation board members slowly lowered her champagne glass. Ryan stared openly at Thomas now. "What?" he whispered. Brooke turned toward him instantly. "Ryan." But Thomas was not finished. "Additionally," he continued calmly, Arthur Holloway established specific legal protections 6 weeks before his passing concerning coercion related to estate matters. Brooke's composure cracked slightly then. "This is inappropriate," she snapped quietly. "Not really," Thomas replied. "Considering multiple real estate consultations have already occurred involving this property." Several guests shifted uncomfortably. Brooke's face paled beneath the ballroom lighting. "That is ridiculous." Thomas calmly removed another document from the portfolio. "I also have records here involving unauthorized financial transfers made during Arthur Holloway's hospitalization." Ryan stepped backward, slowly as though the floor beneath him had suddenly become unstable. "Brooke," he whispered again, this time differently. Not protective anymore. Uncertain. Brooke turned toward him sharply. "Do not do this here." But the room had already changed. Minutes earlier, she stood at the center of admiration, surrounded by donors, photographers, and socialites eager to praise her generosity. Now, every whisper around the ballroom carried a different tone entirely. Suspicion travels quickly in rooms built on reputation. Thomas finally handed me the sealed envelope Arthur instructed him to protect until the right moment arrived. My fingers rested lightly against the paper before opening it carefully. Inside was a handwritten statement from Arthur himself. I recognized the steady shape of his handwriting immediately. "My dearest Margaret, if this letter is being read publicly, then the people closest to us have forgotten something important. Kindness is not weakness. Patience is not surrender. And this home was built with love, not ambition." My eyes blurred briefly before I continued. "Any individual who attempts to pressure, manipulate, or isolate my wife regarding financial decisions forfeits discretionary access to all future Holloway family trust distributions effective immediately." A stunned silence swept across the ballroom. Ryan looked physically ill now. "Trust distributions?" he repeated faintly. Thomas nodded once. "Arthur established layered family trusts years ago. Ryan's access was always conditional." Brooke stared at me as though seeing me clearly for the first time since Arthur died. Not fragile. Not confused. Not powerless. Her voice dropped almost to a whisper. "You knew?" I folded Arthur's letter carefully in my hands. "Not at first." "How long?" she asked quietly. I looked at her steadily beneath the warm chandelier light, while dozens of silent guests watched from every corner of the room. "Long enough." Ryan suddenly covered his face with one trembling hand before lowering himself heavily into a nearby chair. The realization settling over him looked worse than anger. It looked like shame. Genuine shame. Brooke opened her mouth several times as though searching for words strong enough to reverse what had just happened publicly. None came. Because there are moments when truth arrives so cleanly that manipulation finally loses its shape completely. Thomas closed the portfolio calmly and stepped beside me once more. "Margaret," he asked softly, "would you like me to continue?" I looked around the ballroom slowly. At the donors avoiding eye contact. At the photographers pretending not to listen. At Ryan sitting silently beneath the weight of everything he helped create. Finally, I looked toward Brooke. Her confidence was gone now. So was the performance. For the first time since Arthur's funeral dinner, she looked uncertain. Human. Small. I shook my head gently. "No," I replied quietly. "I think everyone understands enough already." The gala ended quietly after that. No dramatic shouting. No scenes. Wealthy people rarely collapse publicly when humiliation arrives. They simply leave faster than usual. One by one, guests collected their coats, avoided direct eye contact, and disappeared into the warm Charleston night beneath the glow of the driveway lanterns. The string quartet packed their instruments in near silence, while caterers cleared untouched desserts from silver trays throughout the dining room. Brooke vanished upstairs less than 15 minutes after Thomas finished speaking. Ryan remained seated near the ballroom windows long after everyone else had drifted away, staring into his untouched glass of bourbon as though the answer to his entire life might somehow settle at the bottom. I stood alone beside the fireplace, holding Arthur's letter while the last staff members quietly folded linens around us. The house finally felt still again. Honest again. Thomas approached me near midnight as workers loaded floral arrangements into vans outside. "Are you all right?" he asked softly. I looked around the room slowly. Arthur's antique oak tables had been moved back into place after Brooke's event planners removed the modern furniture earlier that evening. The family photographs she tried hiding now sat once again where they belonged along the library shelves. I answered carefully, this is the first moment I have actually breathed since Arthur died. Thomas nodded gently. He would be proud of you. I smiled faintly. No. Arthur would be relieved. After Thomas left, I walked upstairs alone. The house creaked softly beneath the weight of old wood settling into nighttime silence. As I passed the guest bedroom, I noticed the door standing partially open. Brooke's designer suitcases were lined neatly beside the bed. Half the closet already stood empty. I continued walking without stopping. Some endings do not require confrontation. Sometimes truth itself does all the work quietly. The following morning, rain covered Charleston in a soft gray haze. I woke early, wrapped myself in Arthur's old navy robe, and carried coffee onto the back porch overlooking the garden. The hydrangeas glistened beneath the storm like pale blue watercolor paintings. For the first time in weeks, the house felt peaceful instead of tense. No whispered phone calls. No strangers measuring furniture. No carefully disguised conversations stopping when I entered rooms. Around 8 o'clock, I heard the front door open and close softly inside the house. A few minutes later, Ryan stepped onto the porch holding 2 coffee mugs. He looked older somehow. Not physically older, just stripped of certainty. I made yours the way Dad used to, he said quietly while handing me the mug. 2 sugars. Splash of cream. I accepted it silently. Ryan sat beside me facing the garden for several moments before speaking again. Brooke left early this morning. His voice sounded hollow. She went to stay with her sister in Charlotte. Rain tapped softly against the porch railing between us. Finally, Ryan exhaled heavily and rubbed his tired eyes. I do not even know when things became like this. I stared out toward the marsh beyond the property line while considering his words carefully. People rarely notice small compromises while they are happening, I replied softly. That is why they become dangerous. Ryan lowered his head. I never wanted to hurt you. The sadness in his voice felt genuine now. But genuine regret does not erase damage. It only arrives after consequences finally become impossible to ignore. No, I said quietly. That is what makes this so painful. He swallowed hard before looking toward me again. Did Dad really think I would betray you? The question lingered heavily between us. I thought about Arthur's letter, about the safeguards, about the trust clauses designed specifically for this moment. Then I remembered something else too. Arthur never stopped loving Ryan. Not once. Even while preparing for the possibility of disappointment. Your father believed people can lose themselves slowly, I answered carefully. But he also believed they could find themselves again if they were willing to face the truth. Ryan looked away immediately, eyes shining with restrained emotion. For several minutes, neither of us spoke. We simply listened to rain moving gently through the garden Arthur planted with his own hands years earlier. Finally, Ryan whispered something so quietly I almost missed it. I am sorry, Mom. I closed my eyes briefly. There it was. Not an excuse. Not a justification. Just sorrow. Real sorrow. And somehow that hurt more than Brooke's ambition ever did. A week later, the house had settled back into its old rhythms. The original security system returned. Arthur's photographs remained untouched. The event planners disappeared. So did the conversations about simplifying my life. Ryan visited often now, though more carefully than before. Grief had humbled him in ways success never could. As for Brooke, I heard little. Charleston society moves quickly toward newer scandals once old ones become uncomfortable. One evening near sunset, I sat alone on the back porch wrapped in a light sweater while cicadas hummed softly through the trees. Arthur's letter rested folded beside me on the table next to a half-finished cup of tea. The sky glowed amber over the marshland beyond our garden, the exact shade Arthur always loved most during summer evenings. I thought about everything that happened since the funeral dinner. The manipulation, the silence, the waiting, and I realized something unexpected. Revenge had never truly been what I wanted. What I wanted was dignity, truth, peace inside my own home again. Arthur spent 43 years protecting the life we built together. In the end, he even protected me from people we both loved. I waited for the perfect moment, and when it finally arrived, I did not choose revenge at all. I chose to stop surrendering my silence to people who no longer deserved it.